I don't think of myself primarily as a philosopher. Philosophers write for other philosophers. And philosophers are nowadays nearly always professors. I'm not a professor anymore, so what I do is I would think of myself as a writer. And who do I write for? I write for anyone who is discontented with the prevailing view of the world. I don't write to convert them to my view. I'm not interested in converting anyone. I'm not even interested in persuading anyone of anything, but simply to present to them through literature or through the lives of interesting people some thoughts and questions that they might find stir their imagination, and then they can do with that what they want.
Londres, verão de 2013. John Gray, filósofo. Para muitos, um pessimista. O progresso é um mito que sobrevive. Se os humanos amam a liberdade, grande parte da história foi um erro. A tortura e a barbárie não residem apenas em lugares distantes. A humanidade pode não caminhar para um destino. Não avançamos passo a passo para um mundo melhor. E a civilização liberal apoia-se em sonhos. E, no entanto, existe conforto. Há 7 mil milhões de seres humanos vivos que beneficiam dos avanços da ciência, do conhecimento, da saúde pública e da produtividade agrícola. As mulheres e as minorias estão a vencer a luta pela igualdade. John Gray, um pessimista esclarecido, talvez. Encontramos um homem maduro, afável, discreto. Sentámos-nos num canto acolhedor, no jardim da sua agência literária londrina. Tarde amena, árvores, uma ligeira brisa. Pensar o desenvolvimento humano e a liberdade levou-nos do último livro de John Gray, O Silêncio dos Animais, para as ideias de progresso, ciência, civilização e, claro, os mitos. Os bons e os maus mitos. Do you think that progress is a useful idea?
It's the idea of progress that is the chief modern faith that I'm interrogating. Not so much utopia, because nearly all modern believers in progress would deny that they're utopians, but the idea of that in human life, I mean, the central belief, the central faith, or as I would call it, the central myth of progress, is that human affairs, human events, human development can replicate that of science, or more generally the growth of knowledge. That's to say that in human history, just as errors are corrected in science and human knowledge grows, so the evils of human life can be gradually diminished or even eliminated, but at any rate diminished in human life, step by step across the generations. That's the central idea of the myth of progress. Now, as you know from my book, The Silence of Animals, I think there is progress in that sense in science. I'm not a postmodernist or a relativist about science. My reason for rejecting that postmodernist view of science is not so much a philosophical reason as, if you like, a brute fact. The reason that there are nearly around 7 billion human beings on the planet, and not only a million, as there were I don't know, 100,000 years ago, or even less, is because of the spin-offs from the growth of knowledge from science in intensive farming, public health, and many other respects. So I think there is progress in science. Human knowledge does increase and grow, and even the rate of growth of human knowledge is accelerating. But the myth of progress is the belief that ethical and political life, or if you like, civilization, can advance in a similar way. And far from believing that, which, as you say, in the 19th century and the early 20th century was associated with imperialism, that belief, later it became connected with communism, later after that then with certain types of neoconservatism and of free market liberalism. The myth is that human life, human history, is tending towards a kind of steady, cumulative advance in which once a certain level of civilization has been achieved, it can be maintained and built on so that you later on you can ascend to ever higher. Now, this needn't be inevitable. Many people who think this don't think it's inevitable. And it needn't be tending towards what we usually think of as utopia, but it's a kind of steady progressive. Now, I think that is a myth, because if you look at the century that ended within our lifetimes, the 20th century, it's a period in which the level of barbarism was greater than ever before in human history, not only in scale, which was absolutely vast, if you like, experiments in barbarism in Nazi Germany, in Soviet Russia, and in Mao's China. But I would say even in the intensity of barbarism, I mean, throughout history there have been persecuted minorities. Women were persecuted in the period of the witchcraft crazes. Gays have been persecuted repeatedly in Christian times. Racial, ethnic, and other minorities have been murdered. And of course in Latin America there was a huge destruction of indigenous peoples when the Spaniards came. So all that's happened before. But where the 20th century was distinctive is that the knowledge and technology which had been gained through the advance of science was used to industrialize killing on an enormous scale, and also to carry out terrible experiments, as happened in the Nazi period during the Holocaust, and against the background of the belief that these terrible examples of barbarism, barbaric atrocities, were in some sense or other justified by scientific theory, because we forget that sometimes that Nazism was not only an extreme version of traditional European prejudices against gypsies and gays, as well as, of course, and primarily against Jews, but also that in the Nazi period, many of the Nazis believed that it had a scientific basis. That many of them took from 19th century German biologists' theories of racial hierarchy. So it was a so-called scientific racism, just as in the Soviet Union, dialectical materialism was supposed to be scientific. So what's distinctive about the 20th century, I suppose, is that the atrocities that were committed, forms of barbarism that were perpetrated, were larger and more intense, but also they were supposedly backed by science, backed by reason. There have been real advances. Women are more emancipated, gays are more emancipated than before. There are aspects of our civilization in which there are what I think of as real, genuine gains. But the reason that I don't think of them in terms of progress is this: they can all be very easily and very quickly lost. And to take an example, one of the genuine gains in civilization in the world was the prohibition of torture. Torture didn't stop, it went on in Algeria, in Vietnam, in China, in Russia. But the prohibition of torture had a kind of restraining effect. So I support the prohibition. I believe in I'm a strong supporter of the prohibition of torture. But at the start of the 21st century, that prohibition was relaxed, not in a tyranny, not in some dark reactionary, forgotten small regime, but in the world's preeminent liberal democracy, America. And we had recently the American former Vice President Cheney, defending waterboarding, which in the Second World War, if someone was found guilty of waterboarding, German or Italian or Japanese, they were given a long sentence of hard labor because it was torture. Now it's back. And so that's what happens with the evils of human life. The evils of human life don't disappear, they recur. They often recur under new names or new descriptions. So, for example, slavery in the 20th century occurred in Europe under the Nazis as Lebensraum. They expanded and enslaved those they didn't kill. It recurred in the Soviet Union under a socialist construction. It recurred in China in many forms, and now it recurs in this kind of capitalist period as human trafficking. It's a form of slavery. Just as torture recurs as enhanced interrogation techniques. It's usually a different name, or often a different name, but the evils recur. Now that's not a reason for giving up, but it's a reason for not believing that the evils will ever go away. The evils never go away. The central evils of human life keep recurring, and the reason they keep recurring is that human beings remain much the same.
Tell me always my time, waste my life and down my phone. Tell me always my time, 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 tell me always my time.
The conflicts of human life don't come from outside. They don't come from error, which many Enlightenment thinkers have thought that if only we were more rational or more correct, if we correct our errors, we wouldn't. They come from the conflicts of human needs, the conflicts of human impulses. And in that sense, I've tried to encourage people to go back and read Freud, who recurs in the recent book, Science of Animals, quite a bit. He's extremely unfashionable now for various reasons, but I think he's a very wise writer in many ways, in that what he argues is that the human mind, the human animal, the human psyche, you could almost say, though of course he wasn't a religious writer, the human soul, is essentially a realm of conflict. So any project of harmony that goes beyond avoiding war and violence, which I think we should try and do, although we won't succeed, but anyone which goes beyond that is dangerous. That's anything that goes beyond the attempt to abolish war, to limit violence, and goes beyond, as it were, the necessary tolerance that we should have of each other's flaws and fallibility is inherently dangerous, and that's, I think, the risk of all forms of utopianism. But even if you put utopianism on one side and you just think of improvement, even the projects of improvement, even if you think of communism, say Soviet communism, as a project of improvement and not as utopia. It was utopian, by the way, and it was an Enlightenment utopia. But let's put that on one side. Just think like these visitors who I discuss in my book, who went to the Soviet Union and were enchanted and captivated and fell in love with it. Supposing they said, no, it's not a utopia, we just think it's a great improvement that's being done. Well, first of all, it ended in farce and disaster, but you could say they mightn't have known that. I still object to it because I still think it's dangerous, because that improvement, if there was improvement, there wasn't much actually for many people, but that improvement was being purchased, was being achieved at the cost of colossal destruction of human life and sorrow and broken and devastated lives. So even if there had been some improvement, more than there was, even if people had inside toilets and better food, if it's being achieved by mass murder, which in that case it was, I'm strongly, I have a strong moral objection, and even a sort of, you might even almost say, aesthetic objection to that. Someone who had a great influence on me was Isaiah Berlin, who I wrote a book about, which is just out in a new edition. And one of his favorite writers was the Russian radical journalist Alexander Herzen. And back then in the 19th century, Herzen was a 19th century figure, lived in London for a while, became a dissident, so to speak, and an emigre. He objected to the sacrifice of one generation for another generation, not just for the sake of utopia, a perfect society, but even for the sake of a better society. It's wrong to destroy or damage, deeply damage, irreparably damage the lives of some people for the sake of for some others. And of course, especially if the others are hypothetical, haven't even been born yet, haven't even been conceived yet. That's even more absurd. But even if they're real, sometimes in a war, in the war against Hitler, for example, we couldn't help damaging other people because bombs fell on cities and killed many innocent people. We couldn't avoid it, but that was that was a struggle against a very great evil, one of perhaps the supreme evil that Europe has yet produced. That's different from using such terrible methods to achieve an incomparably higher level of life. That seems to me to be absurd and a terrible danger. And I think many would now say, of course, believers, we don't support that, we only support democracy. Well, of course, we only support human rights, we don't support any of these terrible totalitarian regimes. But of course, to my mind, that was part of the justification, maybe not the real reason, which might have been geopolitical, for the invasion of Iraq. The idea was that Saddam was a terrible tyrant, human rights were being terribly abused and so on. That was the public rationale. There may have been reasons about oil and so on, but that was the public rationale. But if I ask you, he was of course a terrible tyrant, look what he did to the Marsh Arabs and others. But if you think what happened later, and even during that, first of all, there was the torture at Abu Ghraib. And now, if you lived in Iraq, if you were a woman, would you feel more free? I don't think so. If you were a gay, would you feel more free? If you belonged to any minority, a Christian, would you feel more free? The only beneficiaries of it probably have been the Kurds.
Exactly.
Everyone else is more frightened, more oppressed,
so
more in danger. So even if the goal is not totalitarian, even if the goal is not utopian, even if the goal is human rights or democracy, which isn't utopian because they exist in parts of the world, so they are achievable. Utopias can't be achieved. Human rights can be achieved, at least in a limited form, and democracy can be. Even if it's not utopian, it's still dangerous to use to inflict war, large-scale violence, for the sake of an improvement. Not just dangerous, wrong, actually wrong, I would say. I think there are good and bad myths. I think humans are fated to myth. Humans are myth-making animals. We can't avoid that. The very idea of overcoming myth or leaving myth behind is a myth. But there can be good myths and bad myths, and you could say, how do we tell? The test is twofold, I think. Not exactly a test of truth like in science, because myths aren't science. Myths aren't primitive science. I mean, the error of many Enlightenment thinkers is to say myths are primitive scientific theories. They're not. They're something different. Myth doesn't give truth. Myth gives meaning. The meanings of the lives of those who subscribe to the myths. But myths can still be more or less truthful. And one of the tests, two main tests of good and bad myths, is how close a myth is to the enduring realities of human life. If it accepts the basic realities, which include, in my view, conflict within human beings, conflict within the human soul, then it's a better myth, it's a more truthful myth. Even though myths aren't literally true or false. But there's a second criterion, which is that any myth, which is an ethical criterion, a moral criterion, any myth that gives meaning to life by demonizing other human beings is a bad myth. So the myths of anti-Semitism were bad myths. I think some of the myths of progress are bad myths because they say, well, if only we can get rid of some group. If it's not Jews, then it might be evil capitalist bankers. If we can only get rid of these people, things will advance. That's a bad myth because it demonizes a section of mankind. In the case of the former Soviet Union, by the way, I reviewed a book recently in the Times Literary Supplement by a Romanian writer called Vladimir Tismanianu, in which is an interesting book because he points out that in the initial document of the Soviet Constitution, there was a list of categories of former persons, people who are no longer persons. Former persons, ex-persons, which included priests, rabbis, Muslim teachers, traders, small merchants. They were former persons. And these former persons were denied civil rights. They couldn't stand in elections or get public office. But not only that, perhaps more crucially, they were not allowed the full rations in the rationing system.
Wow.
So what happened to them? And that was part of a myth of progress, because the myth was, well, if we can get rid of these people, will fade away somehow, or die, or no longer be around. We'll have a higher level of humanity, a higher level of... that's a bad myth, because it depends on excluding a certain section of humankind from moral concern, and even demonizing them.
The myth of progress lifts the spirits as it numbs the brain. Wouldn't you agree that the myth of progress is not enduring in the younger generation? It's not central, that being entertained is more of a central piece rather than better your life?
Well, there can be, of course, if people don't have an underlying myth that gives some meaning to their lives, then their purpose will be to distract themselves from themselves. Their purpose will be to forget the lack of such a myth. And that's where distraction and entertainment come in. If you feel your life is meaningful in some way already, if you feel that your life has meaning, you won't want to distract yourself from it all the time. Whereas if you feel your life is essentially meaningless, you don't have a meaning-giving myth in your life, a religious myth or some other myth, then you will seek perpetual distraction. And of course, that's what I think many people do. But of course, that distraction, again, it doesn't go on forever, because if life becomes difficult, if you have the stress of a great economic dislocation or some upheaval, people turn to myth.
Sure.
Again, not always good myths either.
This inequality brings me to capitalism. And when we read your work, you say that capitalism is not ending, it's just changing.
Yeah.
Is capitalism immortal, in a sense, markets?
No, I don't think
and
they're...
because many people believe this.
I don't think they're immortal. I mean, exchange is immortal. I mean, exchange occurs between human beings everywhere, even in concentration camps. People swap cigarettes for other goods and so on. But capitalism is a specific thing. But when I say capitalism renewing itself now, complex, highly developed industrial societies can't manage themselves without some of the institutions of capitalism. That's been proved in the 20th century. I don't believe there can be a comprehensively post-capitalist advanced industrial society anywhere in the world. Now, there can be different types of capitalism, they can have different mixes, there can be various types of state intervention and welfare institutions. So it's not a question of a pure free market. But there's no example. I mean, Kalihari Bushmen can live without capitalism. There was trading in pre-invasion Tibet, but not capitalism. Medieval Europe had trade, but not capitalism. Medieval Islam, similarly. But capitalism isn't immortal. But there's no alternative to the wide range of existing and future, there may be types of capitalism that we haven't developed yet.
It's true.
There's a kind of wide range possible. You see, let me maybe conclude on this. Going back, I think the myths of secular thought are more absurd than the myths of religion. The reason is that many of the myths of religion involve miracles. People are brought back from the dead by a divine miracle. The resurrection of the dead is a miracle. It's contrary to nature. Now, I'm not religious. For practical purposes, I would be an atheist, but I would find it easier to believe in that miracle than I find it that it's a more coherent and rational myth, if you like, simply because it's supposed to be miraculous, than the idea that human beings will become so wise that they produce universal peace, or that they gradually reduce the level of violence in human life, or that they gradually acquire the knowledge to conquer death through technology. They're fantastic, incredible, absurd myths, because they assume something in the course of nature that it won't produce and can't produce. And the example of the immortality of capitalism is similar. If there was a huge catastrophic climate crisis in which human beings were greatly reduced in numbers, and there were only kind of elements of civilization left, there wouldn't be capitalism. What there would be instead would be a few remnants of civilization. Each of them would be more like armed camps. There'd be no capitalism, certainly. But at the moment, and for the foreseeable future, I do think that the goal, I mean, many radicals will find this unpleasant, but I think the goal, if it was achievable, maybe it's utopian, I don't know, would be a more intelligent types of capitalism. Types.
Not one.
Not one type, types. And so in each country should look at what we have and try and make it more intelligent. That may sound modest, but it's very difficult to do in practice. I suppose the fiction I would have is the fiction of humans as extremely resilient creators of meaning in a world that isn't only human. And I think an important fiction is the idea that humans retain their sanity by interacting with something that isn't human. It might even be an invention of humans, like the idea of God, as I think it is an invention, but it doesn't sort of feel like that to those who have it. Or it may be interacting with something which is actually different, like a tree, the leaves of a tree, a forest, the other animals, I said in one of my earlier books that Straw Dogs, that if you want a window out of the human world, you might look at you might go into a monastery or look at an icon, but you could also look at an animal, or even a zoo if it was a good zoo. Humans need windows out of the human world. And any fiction that meets this need and is otherwise part of a good myth, I support.
Chega, Rui, tu vais fazer aqui ao meu lado?
Não. Não está a atrapalhar aqui, para não?
By God, you can be sitting down.
As Evelyn said, he said, if God was an old man with a white beard sitting in a chair, I could believe in him. But if he's a spirit, you have to tell me. Would it flash?
No, it's a video. It's a video photo.
Okay.
Kind of it's a moving image thing.
That's a new thing.
That? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I have to run now, but I'm really enjoyed it. Thank you. I hope you.
Hope we can stay in touch.
Yes. Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.